It began with a thin pamphlet, barely 40 pages long, printed on cheap paper in a small Philadelphia shop. Yet within weeks, it set fire to an entire continent. Kings trembled, colonies roared, and one man, with ink-stained fingers and a stubborn dream of liberty, changed the course of human history forever. Chapter 1. The Stranger Who Walked into Philadelphia. The year was 1774. Philadelphia smelled of rain, rum, and a revolution. The cobblestone streets were slick with mud as ships creaked along the Delaware River, offloading barrels of molasses, crates of tea, and the latest whispers from London. The air was thick with tension. Everyone knew something was coming. They just didn't know what. Among the sailors, merchants, and rebels that crowded the wharves that winter, a thin, tired-looking man stepped off a ship from England. His coat was worn, his face was pale from sickness and the long voyage. In his pocket, folded carefully, was a letter from Benjamin Franklin. His name was Thomas Paine. Few had ever heard of him. No one imagined he would soon become the voice of a revolution. Paine was no aristocrat. He was a failed corset maker, a dismissed tax collector, and a man with more dreams than coins in his pocket. But Franklin's letter, written by one of the most respected men in America, opened doors. It introduced Paine to printers, thinkers, and radicals in the bustling city of Philadelphia. When he first entered Robert Aitken's print shop, the smell of ink and hot metal felt like home. The press clattered rhythmically, spitting out broadsides about Parliament's taxes, Boston's defiance, and the King's stubborn pride. Paine leaned close to the press, watching the wet ink shimmer under the lamplight. Words. Words can move men more than armies. Aitken looked up, amused. "You're a writer, then?" Paine smiled faintly, trying to be. The months passed. Paine found work at the Pennsylvania Magazine, where he wrote essays under pseudonyms, clever, biting pieces that mocked tyranny and questioned royal authority. His words began to attract attention. But by 1775, America was on the edge. British troops had fired on colonists at Lexington and Concord. The cry of liberty was spreading, but few dared to speak the unthinkable: independence. It was one thing to protest taxes. It was another to challenge a king. Even George Washington, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin hesitated to use the word separation. They feared chaos, anarchy, and the wrath of the British Empire. But Paine saw it differently. To him, the colonies weren't children rebelling against their father. They were a people awakening to their destiny. Late one December night, in a cold, rented room on Market Street, Thomas Paine lit a candle and began to write. In the following pages, I offer nothing more than simple facts, plain arguments, and common sense. His pen scratched furiously through the night. Every line burned with conviction. He wrote about the absurdity of monarchy, the cruelty of empire, and the natural right of people to govern themselves. The words were raw, direct, and defiant. No philosopher's Latin, no aristocrat's tone, just the language of the people, sharp, honest, and defiant. When the candle finally burned low, Paine looked at the pages spread before him. He didn't know it yet, but those pages would soon ignite the American Revolution.
The printing press hissed like a living creature that winter morning. Steam rose from the damp pages, carrying the smell of fresh ink into the cold Philadelphia air. Inside a small workshop on Front Street, Robert Bell, one of the city's boldest printers, carefully set the metal letters of a title that would soon become legend. Common Sense, addressed to the inhabitants of America. The author's name was missing, by choice. Thomas Paine didn't want fame, not yet. He wanted freedom. When the first copies rolled out in January 1776, no one could have guessed what they were holding. The pamphlet was thin, only 47 pages, but its words carried the weight of a revolution. It was sold for just 2 shillings, and within days, Philadelphia's taverns were buzzing with the name Common Sense. Merchants, blacksmiths, farmers, even soldiers all passed it hand to hand, reading it aloud by candlelight. It wasn't written like the polished essays of gentlemen. It was blunt, fiery, and human. It said things most Americans had only whispered, that the colonies should cut all ties with Britain, create their own government, and never bow to kings again. Paine's words tore through fear like thunder. The sun never shined on a cause of greater worth. 'Tis not the affair of a city, a country, a province, or a kingdom, but of a continent, of at least 1/8 part of the habitable globe. 'Tis not the concern of a day, a year, or an age. Posterity are virtually involved in the contest, and will be more or less affected, even to the end of time, by the proceedings now. Those lines were like flint striking steel. Something deep in the American heart caught fire. The people's voice. In the taverns of Boston, sailors argued passionately over its pages. In the meeting halls of Virginia, planters recited it aloud. Even in the frozen camps of Washington soldiers, copies of Common Sense were read by firelight. Ordinary men and women, once afraid to speak against the crown, suddenly found words of their own. Paine had given them not just arguments, but permission to dream. He had taken philosophy off the marble shelves of scholars and handed it to the blacksmith, the farmer, the mother by her hearth. "We have it in our power to begin the world over again," he wrote. That single sentence was electrifying. To people who had been told all their lives that power came from kings and bloodlines, it sounded like a prophecy. The elite react. Not everyone rejoiced. Many of the educated elite, even those sympathetic to independence, thought Paine's writing too wild, too emotional, too dangerous. John Adams, after reading it, admitted it was powerful, but complained that Paine's passion might set the world aflame. Loyalists called it sedition. Some claimed the author was a madman, a heretic, or worse, a traitor. But for every critic, there were 1,000 believers. By spring, Common Sense had sold over 120,000 copies, an astonishing number in a country of barely 3 million. Some historians later claim as many as 500,000 copies circulated across the colonies. No other piece of writing in the 18th century had ever moved a population so quickly, so completely. A nation awakens. In the backwoods cabins, men who had never seen a printing press before now passed around worn pages. In southern plantations, whispers of rebellion mingled with the hum of the fields. In northern churches, preachers quoted Paine's words from the pulpit. It was as if the American people had been waiting for someone to say aloud what they already felt in their bones. The idea of freedom, once fragile and uncertain, now had a voice, a shape, a destiny. In April 1776, as the cherry trees blossomed in Philadelphia, Paine walked through the city streets and saw men nailing notices to doors. "Independence now!" He heard merchants refusing British goods, children chanting liberty songs, and taverns ringing with shouts of "No king but God." The movement was unstoppable. That summer, the Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia once again. Among them sat men who had read Common Sense, men who had been stirred by its raw conviction. They debated, argued, and hesitated, until finally, on July 2, 1776, they voted to break from Britain. 2 days later, they signed the Declaration of Independence. The book's invisible hand. While the names of Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin would be carved into history, Thomas Paine's name remained hidden in the shadows, just as it had been on the first printing of his pamphlet. But in truth, the Revolution's spark had been lit long before the ink dried on the Declaration. It began that winter night in Paine's small rented room, with the scratching of a pen and the courage of one man's conviction. Without the pen of the author of Common Sense, John Adams later admitted, the sword of Washington would have been raised in vain. As the colonies became a nation, the legend of common sense spread across the Atlantic. European monarchs tried to ban it. British loyalists burned it. But its words could not be silenced. They had already escaped into the bloodstream of a new world, a world that believed ordinary people could rule themselves. And Thomas Paine, the poor corset maker turned revolutionary writer, had done what no army could. He had made America believe in itself.
By the spring of 1776, the pamphlet, Common Sense, had become more than a bestseller. It was an act of rebellion. Every copy that passed from hand to hand felt like a whispered declaration of war. In London, the British press called it a dangerous contagion. Copies were seized at ports, and colonial printers were warned not to reprint it. But it was too late. The words had escaped, carried by merchants, sailors, and soldiers returning home. The king's ministers read the pamphlet with disgust. George III reportedly called it insolent beyond measure. Loyalists in America, terrified of what it might inspire, began to label Paine a traitor. His name became a curse in British-controlled towns. Yet Paine himself lived quietly in Philadelphia, still renting a modest room near Market Street. He was neither rich nor safe. Friends warned him that the Crown's agents might come for him, and that a British gallows awaited any man found guilty of treason. Paine's answer was simple: if the cause is right, the danger is a privilege. The American people had begun to see him not as a stranger from England, but as a prophet of freedom. When Continental soldiers marched, they carried torn copies of Common Sense in their packs. When taverns filled with talk of liberty, someone always quoted his lines. But the revolution had only begun, and soon Paine would find that the pen which made him famous could also make him hunted. As the British Army invaded New York that summer, the war turned brutal. American morale sank. Washington's troops were starving, freezing, and losing ground. Paine went to the front lines, not to fight with a musket, but with words. In December 1776, he began writing another pamphlet, this one even more urgent, even more desperate. It opened with the immortal words, "These are the times that try men's souls." Printed as the American Crisis, it became the rallying cry of the Revolution. Washington himself ordered it read aloud to his troops before they crossed the icy Delaware River to attack Trenton on Christmas night. When they won that battle, soldiers said it was Paine's words that had given them courage. But while the colonies cheered, Britain plotted. The Crown wanted Paine silenced. Secret orders were sent to capture him if possible. British spies searched for his whereabouts, while Loyalist papers printed his name with venom. Even among American elites, Paine's popularity made some uneasy. He was poor, outspoken, and unafraid to criticize anyone, even Congress itself. His bluntness won him enemies on both sides of the ocean. Yet he never stopped writing. To Paine, freedom wasn't a slogan, it was a sacred duty. He believed that the American Revolution wasn't just for the colonies, but for all humanity. In the streets of Philadelphia, when news of British defeats began to spread, printers once again rushed to reprint Common Sense in the crisis. Paine's words had become ammunition of the mind, as vital as any musket or cannon. By 1777, Thomas Paine was both celebrated and condemned, a man who had no army, yet struck fear into an empire. The book he had written in the quiet of a rented room was now banned across Britain, but alive in every American heart. He was no longer just Thomas Paine,
the corset maker from Thetford. He was the enemy of kings, and the revolution had found its voice. The year was 1777, and America was both victorious and broken. The Declaration of Independence had been signed, but the war was far from won. The air in Philadelphia smelled of smoke and sweat. The newborn nation was gasping for breath. Thomas Paine, once an outsider, now walked among generals, congressmen, and dreamers who called themselves patriots. Yet he saw the truth few dared to admit. The revolution was splintering. The Continental Congress was divided, supplies were short, the army was starving, soldiers deserted by the dozens, their bare feet leaving blood on frozen ground. Even Washington's calm resolve was cracking under the weight of defeat. In those desperate months, Paine became the voice that refused to die. The pen among swords. He traveled with the army through the mud and chaos, writing by firelight, sometimes with gunfire echoing in the distance. He saw men shiver in rags and still whisper the word freedom. And every time he saw despair, he wrote. The harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. His words became bandages for the nation's wounds. Washington often read them aloud to his officers, calling Paine's writings the soul of the revolution. But for Paine, the dream was bigger than a battlefield victory. He wanted a country that would stand for justice, not kings or privilege, but ordinary people with extraordinary rights. The birth of an ideal. In 1778, Paine took a government position as secretary to the Committee on Foreign Affairs, working with diplomats like Silas Deane and Benjamin Franklin. He saw politics up close, and what he saw disgusted him. He discovered corruption, secret deals, and self-serving ambitions among men who claimed to fight for liberty. When Paine exposed Silas Deane for selling weapons to profit from the war, Congress turned on him. His honesty made enemies faster than his fame could protect him. They forced him to resign. Betrayed by the very leaders his words had lifted, Paine walked away from Congress with nothing but his pen and his principles. Those who expect to reap the blessings of freedom, he wrote bitterly, must, like men, undergo the fatigue of supporting it. Exile within victory. By 1781, the tide began to turn. The French alliance brought supplies, and Washington's troops won stunning victories. When Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, the world changed forever. The British Empire had been defeated by an army of farmers, shopkeepers, and dreamers. The war was over, but Paine did not celebrate as others did. He had seen too much: greed, betrayal, and the quiet corruption creeping into the soul of the new republic. He knew the fight for freedom did not end with peace treaties. Independence, he said to a friend, is only the first breath. A nation must learn to live. The forgotten hero. While others rose to fame, Paine faded into the background. He refused wealth, refused titles, refused to claim the profits his writings had earned for others. He was poor again, but proud. His friends warned him to rest, to enjoy the peace, but Paine couldn't stop thinking about something bigger. If monarchy was evil in America, was it not evil everywhere? If liberty was a right, shouldn't it belong to all humanity? His gaze turned across the ocean, back to Europe, where kings still ruled and people still bowed. A new storm was brewing there, and Thomas Paine was already walking toward it.
It was 1787. America was free, at least in name, but Thomas Paine couldn't rest. The revolution, to him, wasn't a place, it was a fire. And he could feel that same fire flickering across the Atlantic. France. A nation of kings, priests, and peasants trembling on the edge of collapse. Paine sailed for Europe, leaving behind the country he had helped create. The voyage was rough, the sea restless, as if echoing the chaos he was sailing toward. When he arrived in Paris, he was greeted not as a stranger, but as a legend. His book, Common Sense, had been translated into French years earlier.
His name was whispered in cafes and universities. L'ami de la liberté, the friend of liberty. But Paine saw what most did not. The streets smelled of hunger. The poor starved while nobles danced in gold-lit halls. He knew the revolution was coming. Storm before the fire. In England, Paine published another bombshell, Rights of Man, 1791. It was a direct response to Edmund Burke's criticism of the French Revolution. While Burke defended the monarchy, Paine thundered back with words that shook empires. The cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind. He declared that governments existed only by the consent of the governed, and that kings had no divine right to rule. The book spread like wildfire. In taverns, printing shops, and secret clubs, people read it out loud by candlelight. The British government panicked. King George III called him a traitor. They burned his book in public squares. Warrants were issued for his arrest. But Paine was already gone, back to France, where history was about to explode. A new revolution. 1789 had unleashed the impossible. The Bastille had fallen. The people had risen. And now, as 1792 dawned, France declared itself a republic. Paine became a hero once more, elected to the French National Convention despite barely speaking the language. He sat beside men like Robespierre, Danton, and Marat, all drunk on the wine of liberty and vengeance. But Paine's vision of freedom was pure, and that purity made him dangerous. When the convention voted to execute King Louis XVI, Paine stood up in defiance. He did not love kings, but he could not love killing either. Kill the king, but spare the man. Let his death be the death of monarchy, not mercy. The room went silent. Robespierre's glare was cold as iron. Paine had spoken the truth, but truth was no longer welcome. The Terror. 1793. The revolution devoured its own children. Robespierre ruled through fear. The guillotine sang day and night. And Thomas Paine, the foreigner who dared preach mercy, was thrown into prison. His cell was damp, his health failing. Each morning, prisoners were marked for execution, a chalk mark drawn on the door by the guards. One night, they marked Paine's door as well. But by pure chance, the door had been left open when they made the mark, on the outside instead of the inside. When the guards came the next morning, they passed by, thinking the cell empty. That small mistake saved his life. Months later, when Robespierre fell, Paine was released, a ghost of the man he once was. The Age of Reason.
In the quiet aftermath, Paine wrote his most daring work yet, The Age of Reason. This time, his rebellion was not against kings, but against the power of organized religion. He wrote not as an atheist, but as a believer in God and logic. My mind is my own church. But the world wasn't ready. Americans turned against him. The French forgot him. Even old friends like Washington refused to answer his letters. Paine had sparked revolutions across 2 continents, and now he walked alone, the twilight of a revolutionary. He returned to America in 1802, sick and penniless. The nation he had helped give birth to barely remembered him. When he tried to vote in New Rochelle, they told him he wasn't an American citizen. When he died in 1809, Only 6 people attended his funeral. No monument, no marble, just a small grave on a farm road, lost to history. And yet, every word he wrote still burns in the veins of every free nation. Time makes more converts than reason. Thomas Paine never lived to see the world he dreamed of, but every generation that fights for justice still walks in his shadow. The silence after the storm. When Thomas Paine died in 1809, the United States was already moving on. The revolution he had helped ignite was now an established government. The fire of rebellion had turned into the order of a new nation. But in that new order, there was no room for the restless soul who had challenged kings and churches alike. He had made too many enemies among the clergy, the politicians, and even the founding fathers who once called him a friend. His books were banned in some towns. Preachers called him the devil's writer. Schoolchildren were warned never to read The Age of Reason. In time, his grave disappeared, his bones dug up by an admirer who tried to bring them back to England only to lose them along the way. Thomas Paine vanished, body and memory both, scattered to the winds. The return of his voice. But truth once spoken never dies. And Paine's words, sharp, honest, eternal, waited under the dust for the right ears to hear them again. Decades later, in the 1830s, a new generation of reformers began to quote him once more. Abolitionists fighting to end slavery found courage in his call for universal liberty. Workers demanding fair wages echoed his belief in equality. And women's rights activists saw in him a man who had written, long before his time, that man has no property in man. Even Abraham Lincoln read Paine. His biographers later said that common sense shaped his vision of democracy more than any sermon or law book ever could. Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, Lincoln once said. The same idea Paine had thundered half a century before. A nation rediscovers its rebel. By the early 20th century, America was once again at a crossroads, facing inequality, corruption, and war. Writers and thinkers began to dig back through the past, searching for voices that spoke truth without fear. They found him, Thomas Paine. In classrooms, libraries, and union halls, his words came alive again. These are the times that try men's souls. The sentence that had inspired soldiers in 1776 now inspired workers in 1910 and again in 1960, when Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of a revolution of conscience. Paine had not been erased. He had only been sleeping. The prophet of every age. Paine's dream was not for one nation, it was for all humanity. He imagined a world where freedom and reason would guide the hearts of men, not kings or dogma. When revolutions erupted in Latin America, his writings were translated into Spanish. When Gandhi led India's struggle for independence, he quoted Paine's moral logic. When students in the 1960s protested injustice, his words once again marched with them in banners and in speeches. Thomas Paine's body had died in obscurity, but his spirit became immortal. The world caught up with him, 1 century at a time. The legacy lives on. Today, more than 200 years later, his pamphlets still circulate, not as relics, but as warnings against tyranny, against blind obedience, against forgetting where freedom truly comes from. In museums, his worn-out copies of Common Sense lie under glass, the paper yellow, the ink faded, yet the message burns as bright as ever. The cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind. Those words were not just for 1776. They were for every voice that dares to speak truth in the face of power. Epilogue. The Eternal Rebel. A quiet farmhouse in New Rochelle. The wind moves through the grass where no headstone stands.
But if you listen closely, you can almost hear him. The man who lit the fuse of liberty with nothing but his pen. Thomas Paine, printer, revolutionary, exile, the forgotten prophet who gave the world its most dangerous idea, that ordinary people could think for themselves.